Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Shaftesbury Society from the John Locke Foundation. I'm Donna Martinez. I'm coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh. So glad that you are along with us. Wherever you are, hopefully you are safe and you are healthy. Here in Midtown Raleigh, I can tell you we are bouncing back and forth between winter and spring weather. So we're trying to make it to spring. Hope wherever you are that things are going well for you and your family. We got another great discussion planned for you on this Monday. Well, we've all long thought of the college campus as the classic marketplace of ideas where young people go there to learn to be critical thinkers, to open up their minds to the pros and cons, maybe even have their minds changed about things that they had long held to be truth for themselves, and to be able to engage in policy discussions and debates in order to discern those facts and come to their own conclusions about life and things happening around them. The question today is that really the case anymore today? Is it really the marketplace of ideas? Well, a fascinating new report addresses that issue. It's called Political Reality on North Carolina Campuses, examining policy debates and forums with diverse viewpoints. It looks at that question, and today we're going to hear what that study actually revealed. Professor George Noue is the author of that. He's going to be joining us in just a moment. We're going to talk today about all of these issues, free speech, the political climate, and more. Joining us today for our panel, Jenna Robinson, who is president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Jenna's organization published this report by Professor Noue, and here's the cover of that report. Also along for the discussion today is Professor Mark McNeely with the UNC Keenan-Flagler Business School. You may recognize Professor McNeely from Shaftesbury discussion, probably about a year or so ago, because he is the co-author of a March 2020 report on free expression and dialogue at UNC Chapel Hill. Glad to have him joining us today as well. Also on the panel, my colleague here at the Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai, and as I mentioned, Professor George Noue. He is Research Professor of Political Science and Research Professor of Public Policy, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So panelists, welcome. So glad you are along. Professor Noue, let's begin by giving you the virtual floor. Tell us about your study.
Thank you. And thank you, Donna and the John Locke Foundation for this opportunity, and for the three panelists who graciously join in on the discussion. It will be a lively one, I'm sure. And to the Pope Foundation, which financed the original research, and particularly to Rabbi Adam Schulman, who did the really tough work in examining university calendars, going back and forth to try to get the data for the report. Without him, this would not have been a report of the substance that I think it is. So let me say a word about the context. As it is for our nation, this is a tumultuous time for American higher education. Its financial foundations have been undermined, for some campuses perilously so, and I think some of those are in North Carolina. There is little room for raising tuition and increasing student debt. Most state governments and state and local governments will struggle to balance their budgets. In many parts of the country, there will be significant declines in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds. Traditional teaching models have been disrupted, and there have been fierce ideological challenges to what even should be in the curriculum. Perhaps worst of all, polls show that higher education has lost the support of many Americans. So amid this turmoil, why should we focus on campus free speech issues? I think John Locke would agree that protecting and promoting free speech is essential to both liberty and education. As an Oxford graduate with 3 degrees, he once said, "Of all the men we meet, 9 parts of 10 of what they are, good or evil, useful or not, is by their education." He was also an empiricist, always testing to see what was true. He proclaimed that whatever I write, as soon as I discover it is not true, my hand shall throw it into the fire. So unless ideas, particularly about public policy, can be tested in free and civil discourse, democracy is undermined. And the place we would expect that discourse to be most valued would be on the higher education campuses. Is our expectation indeed our trust warranted. In 2019, Carolina Academic Press published my book, Silent Stages. You see the cover there. The Loss of Academic Freedom and Campus Policy Debates. It reports research, excuse me, it reports research completed by a team of 6 law and graduate students and myself on what policy issues were debated or were topics of forums with diverse viewpoints at 97 top campuses nationwide and 27 law schools in 2014 and 2015. These campuses enrolled more than 1 million students. We found that debates about any public policy were very rare, and forums often were advocacy sessions for a single viewpoint. With the help of a grant from the Pope Foundation and the sponsorship of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, I repeated that research in North Carolina. I selected North Carolina because its higher education system is very diverse, reflecting every type of campus except military academy. And also I have a fondness for the state since part of my family lives in Durham. The research report, we might show the cover of that. Mitch, if you could show the cover of the research report. Good, thank you. The research report, Political Reality on North Carolina Campuses, Examining Public Policy Debates and Forums with Diverse Viewpoints, documents that public policy debates and forums with diverse viewpoints regarding 24 policy issues on 35 North Carolina campuses during the pre-COVID period of 2018 and 19. Report is 45 pages with 53 footnotes, so I'm only going to discuss the highlights, focusing mostly on its recommendations. But first, let me ask the question, why focus on debates and forums? Social media and late night TV may be the way most students hear about public policy, but these forums are often siloed and have other flaws. Serious discourse may take place in the campus newspaper, or in a classroom, or in a lecture hall, or they may not. But a number of national polls and the very rigorous campus climate surveys, such as Professor McNeely and his colleagues conducted at UNC Chapel Hill, report that students often feel intimidated in expressing their opinions or asking tough questions. As a thought experiment, last Friday, you can take that down, Mitch. Last Friday, I checked my YouTube feed. My algorithms highlight naturally politics, but also history, sports, and music. Examining the politics feeds dominated by recent confirmation hearings and the 1.9 COVID Relief Act, the YouTube headlines describing the policy dialogues by using these verbs: slams, torches, blasts, rips, rails, mocks, grilled, and destroyed. No wonder we're in such a polarized country, and so many students are afraid to speak their minds, and the language is often worse on Facebook and Twitter. A well-structured debate or forum, however, with 2 or more informed advocates who respect each other, can have 3 outcomes for students and others in the academic community. 1, a person's previous policy predisposition can now better articulate the reasons for that predisposition. 2, hearing new arguments, a person might change her or his mind. 3, listening to both sides might help a person to understand how complex these issues are and be undecided and searching for more information. A person might conclude that all policy answers do not reside in left or right silos or Democrat or Republican platforms. All of these are desirable educational outcomes and encourage critical thinking. So did our research find such beneficial policy debates or forums were common on North Carolina campuses? Despite a few promising examples, debates and forums were as rare on North Carolina campuses in 2018 and 2019 as we found in our national sample in 2014 and 2015. And I encourage our listeners to read the entire report for a description of events on each of the North Carolina campuses. So an important question is why does such a vacuum exist when every campus would insist that training thoughtful citizens is an important priority? After I published Silent Stages, I had a conference call with the chancellor and provost of a public Colorado campus, who seemed very much in favor of more policy debates and forums. After about 30 minutes of discussing how such events could be structured, including cooperation with neighboring campuses, I was asked why such events hadn't occurred on their campus before. I thought it was sort of a strange question. I was 2,000 miles away, after all. Finally, I asked whether any budget had been set aside for such events or whether the responsibility in an office or committee for them had been identified. When the answer was no, the identification of the problem and its solution was obvious. You have to have a budget and you have to have some institutional arrangement for sponsoring these events. But why haven't such steps been taken before? There are budgets and responsibilities, assignments for a myriad of campus activities. I think there are 4 explanations, which, if you like, we could explore later. One is universities have become quite branding conscious and corporate in their management styles. Controversy about anything are inconsistent with that style. Second, student affairs bureaucracies have grown enormously in the last 2 decades, and they often see their mission as keeping campuses safe, unified, and fun. Research shows they are fairly homogeneous in their political orientations. Events discussing controversial subjects may seem alarming to them. Third, the faculty has also grown politically more homogeneous, which may decrease their interest in identifying and sponsoring subjects for policy debates. The reward system for faculty does not incentivize them to sponsor or participate in such debates or forums. And fourth, on many campuses, there are groups of activist students who would be intolerant of having their ideological convictions challenged, and a few, as the North Carolina report shows, might be willing to disrupt such events. In 2017, the North Carolina legislature passed HB 527, an act to restore and preserve free speech on the campuses and constituent institutions of the University of North Carolina. The next year, the Martin Center and the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education published a report titled, "Do North Carolina Students Have Freedom of Speech?" The authors, one of whom is John Robinson, found that, quote, "In the 8 years since the publication of an earlier report, North Carolina colleges and universities have made remarkable progress in their protection of First Amendment rights on campus. North Carolina is now far and away the nation's leader in the numbers of green light schools within the state." Green light means that there's no official policy and that would condone censorship. These are admirable achievements, but if the result is only that campus rules do not formally suppress free speech and speakers are not shouted down, the outcome may be only a vacuum, where students and community members do not have access to public events, hearing civil discourse about the great issues of facing our nation and North Carolina. We need not only to protect speech, but to promote it. What can be done to create more public policy debates and forums with intellectual diversity? Here I've come to the conclusion, somewhat reluctantly, that the intervention of boards and legislatures will need to be the engines to start and then monitor this process on many campuses. As a 50-year faculty member, I am naturally very protective of academic freedom, and I do not take this intervention easily, likely. Last Wednesday, I had a long discussion with Robert Shively, an executive of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is one of the preeminent defenders of academic freedom in the country. And I ran by the recommendations that I'm about to share with you with him to see whether he thought that the line had been crossed, that asking boards and legislatures to become involved in this process would undermine academic freedom. With one minor exception, he thought my policy recommendations would be compatible with academic freedom. So let me share them with you. And Mitch, if you could put up the first slide. If we could go to number 1, please. Mitch, I think you've got 2 up there. There you go. Good. Thank you. Campuses that affirm a commitment to diversity and inclusion should be required to define those terms and to report whether viewpoint or political diversity is part of the definition and diversity to be sought and measured. Definition and measurement are critical because diversity and exclusion are such vague terms that they can be very subjectively applied as, quote, institutional values, unquote, that cannot be transgressed. Consequently, though perhaps admirable intent, they have chilled speech for both students and faculty, leaving great uncertainty about what controversial subjects can be discussed at all, leading oftentimes to safe spaces, speech codes, and bias response teams. For example, given the diversity and inclusion value, could you make a criticism of illegal immigration, or would that be xenophobic, possibly hate speech? Could you object to reparations, or would that be racist? Could you oppose puberty blockers for minors, or the participation of biological males in women's sports, or would that be transphobic? So if the diversity and exclusion values are not carefully defined and measured, then we can create what I would call a stealth cancel culture, in which issues of great policy importance are simply not discussed because maybe you could get in trouble with the diversity and inclusion value. And there are examples of that. Speech First is now suing the University of Central Florida. Speech First has won cases against bias response teams at the University of Illinois, University of Michigan, University of Texas. The University of Central Florida is an institution of 71,000 students. About 26,000 of them are part-time, yet the university feels that it can impose speech restrictions that are not imposed on any other citizen. Let's go to number 2. Governing boards should establish a reporting requirement regarding the number and substance of public policy debates in forums held on their campuses. When you examine what appears on campus calendars and an enormous number of events that most campuses sponsor, and find that there is a vacuum, a lack of public policy debates and forums, then if the governing board does not establish a requirement about the number and substance of public policy debates, then it doesn't seem like this situation is going to change. Campuses will sponsor hundreds of athletic contests, for example, but not public policy debates and forums. Now, I would not have the governing board dictate the number of such events or the substance of them, the topics, but establishing a reporting requirement seems to me appropriate. 3, the third slide, please. Boards should ask campuses to set policies about what events should be recorded on campus calendars and how these calendars should be publicly accessible. It was a surprise when we began to do this research how inaccessible and how lacking in detail many campus calendars are, so that finding out what kinds of public policy events they sponsored for the whole campus was virtually impossible. Again, if you've ever looked at a campus athletic page to find out what the records of teams are, even the history of these teams, you find that their campuses are meticulous in recording that, but they do not record on their campus calendars what kinds of public policy events they have, which makes it impossible for the public and other stakeholders to know what's going on. 4, boards should encourage campuses to seek outside funding for public policy debates and forums or provide for such events from institutional budgets. The Chapel Hill Public Discourse program is getting some private philanthropy and regards it as important. But if there's no funding source for it, either outside or internal, then it's not likely these events will take place on any systematic way. You might get a particular debate or forum, but having a systemic approach to it so that many public policy events are covered will not take place. 5, boards should encourage campuses to complete campus climate surveys regarding speech realities, such was done at UNC Chapel Hill, and then ask administrators what can be done to remedy any problems discovered. The results at Chapel Hill were quite consistent with what we're now finding nationally. There are a number of such climate surveys done. Brookings has done one, Cato has done one, the Heterodox Academy just released a new one, and there are others. And they all pretty much consistently find that large numbers of students feel intimidated in expressing their policy viewpoints, and that there doesn't seem to be any process for campuses to change that dimension. I believe that a good public policy debate can function like tilling infertile soil. If a student hears that a responsible debate can be had about a public policy question, and student feels that, well, maybe my position would be a minority on that, but there are actually experts who can come in and defend that position, then the student may feel, well, I can express that too. It's a legitimate point of view to be expressed. 6, access to public policy debates or forums held on one campus typically are not accessible to students at other campuses. In the internet era, it is quite easy to remedy that problem. YouTube, webinars, Zooms, recording a policy event should be made easily available. If one campus puts together a really good debate on, say, was the Iran nuclear deal in retrospect a good idea or not, there's no reason why that can't be made available to campuses really all over the country, but certainly within the state. And right now, that is not being done. To conclude, the failure of campuses to make it clear that the great public policy questions are worthy of debate and that diverse viewpoints are welcome has some long-term damaging consequences. The results of a January 20, 2021 Campus Pulse National Student Survey were titled, quote, "College students have little trust in American democracy," unquote. Their elders have also lost trust in a variety of American institutions, including higher education. There are many facets to this distrust, but one thing campuses can do is to sponsor public policy debates and forums with diverse viewpoints. The public, and specifically taxpayers, need to believe that their concerns and commitments are not excluded from campus discourse. Right now, that evidence to counter that feeling of exclusion does not exist nationally or in North Carolina. North Carolina has an enormous diversity of higher education institutions, and the state might become a national model for encouraging civil, well-informed public policy debates and forums. And I hope that my suggestions and the conversations we're about to have will actually encourage the state to take steps that will lead in this direction. If it's just all talk, if everybody just says, well, yeah, it's a good thing to do, but we don't have a budget, there's nobody responsible for it, I think the evidence is that it's not going to happen. Thank you.
Professor Noue, thank you so much. And just as a reminder to you, if you're watching us live here on Facebook, my colleague Brene has posted a link in the comments section to Professor Lanou's report published by the Martin Center. So you'll be able to access it there, read the full report at your leisure. Let me go ahead and bring back in our panelists, Jenna Robinson with the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, my colleague Mitch Kokai with the John Locke Foundation, and Professor Mark McNeely, who is with the UNC Keenan-Flagler Business School. Professor McNeely, let's start with you for a reaction, because Professor Noue has referred several times to the report that you co-authored about UNC Chapel Hill about a year ago. And by the way, just as a reminder, that report also is linked in the comments section of our Facebook page. Professor McNeely, so what's your reaction to what you've heard from Professor Noue?
Yeah, I think a lot of what he said was spot on. I think the research was well done. I think it was a rigorous and broad meta-analysis of the data that are out there. And I think the big takeaway from Professor Lanou's study for me as a business professor is that nothing happens unless the incentives, the organization, and the money are in place, right? That's how it happens in any organization. And without those things, having the right incentives and organization, budget, nothing is going to happen. A couple other thoughts. I do think having debates and panel discussions with speakers that have various perspectives is a good start. And I think that's something that we are doing at UNC with the program for public discourse. So I think that's really a big step in the right direction. And as Professor Noue mentioned, there was a gift that helped move that project along. So that's great. I think in addition to that, something that I think would be very impactful and useful over the long term is training students on how to listen and have a constructive dialogue with someone with which they disagree. And that is something that we in the public really need to learn. And I would have them learn how to do it face-to-face as well as on social media, because that's where on social media is where a lot of the discussions are happening today. I think also it had some very useful recommendations. I think the second recommendation about governing boards establishing a reporting requirement for the different debates is a very useful one. That is, he's very right. It's pretty impossible to find that information. I think number 5 is another one that's very good. Completing a campus climate survey, as we did, that we're actually looking at. I know we've been talking with the Board of Governors at looking at expanding the research we did to the entire university system. So I'm in those discussions with them, along with, of course, my colleagues, and we're going to have a little bit of an update on that this Wednesday. So we should know more perhaps after that. But that is something that's being looked at, extending the research that we did to the rest of at least many of the institutions in the UNC system. And I think the last one as well, having a lot of the debates and forums that are held on campus being, zoomed to the rest of the UNC system would be great, right? Because that is something that we found out of the whole COVID process that we can do pretty well. So I think coming out of this, I think a lot of the recommendations were very good. And I think, the whole idea of having UNC system-wide research on free expression and constructive discourse on students and faculty, and then having the chance to review those findings with the Board of Governors and what their plans are to improve in those areas would be a great idea.
Jenna, I thought it was interesting that Professor Noue talked specifically about wanting to make sure that his recommendations about monitoring and reporting, would that butt up against academic freedom? What are your thoughts, Jenna, about how faculty members would respond to the idea of reporting requirements on something like this?
Well, I've only spoken to a couple faculty members about it, and they've been very positive about the recommendations. And obviously, Professor Noue is a faculty member himself, and as is Mark. And I think that as long as you're not asking faculty to change what they're doing in their classrooms, they're receptive. faculty want to keep control over the textbooks they choose, what they're teaching in the classroom, the curriculum they're using, and the content of their own courses. But as to what's going on more widely on campus, I think faculty are very receptive to that. And I haven't seen any pushback from faculty on that topic. Since I have the floor right now, I do want to add that I'm really grateful to George for doing this work to show us, what students are being exposed to on campus, and for making some positive recommendations, not just on how we can protect free speech, but how we can promote it, which I think is a really important next step. A lot of our universities here in North Carolina have already protected free speech, so students can't be punished for saying things, but they haven't taken the next step to promote and show students, well, this is really how it's done. This is how you have civil discourse. So I'm glad that George made those recommendations.
Jenna, that whole notion that we need to even show people how it's done, civil discourse kind of tells us where we are, unfortunately, in society, because Professor Noue specifically mentioned, and Professor McNeely commented on it, the issue of advocates needing to respect each other. If you're going to go ahead and be involved in a forum, it can't just be, a shout fest or, you're an idiot. No, you're more of an idiot. And so we have to have that, but it seems we're in tough times. Mitch, I know that you participate in a lot of interviews and forums, and you have managed to figure out how to do it in a civil way, but a lot of people haven't.
That's true. And, it's interesting to see this report. And I think one of the things that strikes me about it is that this issue seems to be downstream from some other things that we see in higher education. I just noted a few of them, which were alluded to in the discussion of the report. One of them is this idea of avoiding controversy. College campuses have plenty of controversy regardless. And so why set up another one that's probably guaranteed to create more controversy for you? I could see why some administrators would want to shy away from that. Another one was the homogenous faculty. If your faculty members are closer and closer together in their worldviews, then it's harder for them to find a view that's outside of that bubble that's also deemed acceptable. Some things are always going to be seen as beyond the pale and unacceptable. If everyone is pretty much on agreement on core ideas, what is unacceptable may be a larger pool than what is unacceptable to the public at large. The third thing that I noted is the focus of the faculty itself. If you have faculty members who are mainly involved in research or service, perhaps this idea of putting together a program that's going to be designed to help boost the civic engagement and understanding and participation in discourse of the students might be a little bit lower on their priority list than some other things. It doesn't mean they don't like it, they don't see it as important. It's just not as high on the priority list. And I'll just end with a couple of other things that perhaps are questions to the other panelists. One is, if we're going to have a system that would encourage more programs like the ones that are being discussed here, would this be something that would be well suited to be a UNC system level program, where the UNC System's Board of Governors sets up a program and has individual campuses try to compete for grants to have programs like this? The second question is, what do you do about the costs of putting these events together if the idea is to have the program extend beyond an individual campus? Because if the programs are going to be available system-wide and even to a larger extent nationwide, if you put them out on a Zoom, why would any campus want to go to the expense of bringing in a speaker if they know that anyone else around the state or around the country is going to have access to it? So I'll leave it with that.
I'd like to comment on those. Are very good questions. First, one of the reasons for doing it on a specific campus is to give that campus students exposure to it live and its students to be able to ask questions. After a debate, there should be a time to ask questions, and hopefully the debate will have generated subjects for those questions. But that's a very good thing for a student to stand up and say, I heard you say, but have you thought about the cost of this, or the implementation problems, or the unintended consequences? Wow. When students can do that kind of thing, that's very healthy. The second point I would make is that while there will need to be some funding, it's easy to exaggerate how much this can cost. On any large campus, there will be faculty who are experts in the various public policy issues that need to be discussed, and they can see this as a part of their service, or with perhaps some monetary rewards. There are alumni who could be involved. There are very few public policy questions for which there are not organizations, lobbyists, who would be all too happy to come in and debate, say, what the minimum wage should be, or you name the topic. So there needs to be a budget, but it doesn't have to be a budget that pays speakers $10,000 to come in on a campus. We've seen some examples of that. It's kind of embarrassing. And I think that if you compare what we would need to sponsor, say, 10, 12, 15 public policy events on a campus with what we spend on our most minor sport, producing no revenue, attended by almost nobody, and having an extensive travel schedule, I just don't buy the idea that universities cannot afford this. I just make one other point. The focus on the UNC system is natural, and it's a great system and absolutely key in North Carolina. But my report covers private institutions as well. And there aren't any private institutions that would say, well, we don't have a responsibility for educating our students to be good citizens or to be knowledgeable about public policy. And again, they have individual boards. They're not accountable to the UNC board. They're not accountable to state legislatures, but they do have boards. And if some of those board members say to the president, what kind of public policy events open to all of our students do you sponsor? In most cases, the president's going to say, I'll get back to you on that. President go to the provost will go to the deans, and they'll come up with a report. But if those private institutional boards do not ask the question, then probably not much is going to happen. Presidents are occupied with thousands of other things.
Professor Noue, I thought it was fascinating that one of the things that you revealed in your report had to do with the dearth of information as you sought information on forums and debates, et cetera, but you found plenty of information on athletics. Now, of course, anyone who lives in North Carolina, has spent any time here, knows that college sports are huge here. In fact, when my husband and I moved here from Arizona, several people told us you're going to have to pick a team. And so it is big. So how do we convince people that the infrastructure, the time, and the resources should be spent in equal or some sort of approximate amount to the time and resources spent on athletics and documenting athletics and making all sorts of information available?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I'm certainly not against athletics. Both my sons play intercollegiate lacrosse, and I follow college athletics. And I don't think the issue is so much taking away. It is sitting down and saying, what would we need to have a calendar of, say, 10, 12, 15 policy events? What would that cost? Would we need an extensive travel budget? Would we need honorariums for people? Can we produce some of these events with our existing faculty or alums? It's a planning process, and that budget might look different at different kinds of campuses. For example, I hate to pick on a particular school, but North Carolina State is in Raleigh, and And the resources locally in Raleigh to have public policy debates should be plentiful and shouldn't cost very much. There should be a number of people who would love to come to the campus to say, this is the right public policy. And we didn't find much. So I think different campuses would come up with different amounts after their planning process. And there isn't one size fits all. And particularly if we now Zoom some of these things, you could import some without cost. But the first step is how many do we want? What are the topics? Where can we get speakers? What should this cost? And I don't think we're talking about six-figure budgets here.
We have a couple
Donna,
of
can I leap in for a moment?
Oh, please go ahead, and then I'll get to a couple of comments from Facebook.
Yeah, I thought that perhaps this would be a good opportunity to turn back once again to Mark McNeely, because he actually referenced this a little bit earlier, and that is this notion of making sure there is a planning and a budget and just something in place that would allow this to happen. If I think about campus athletic departments, they are a department that, among having coaches and players, they also have PR teams that staff their websites and do all that sort of thing. This sounds like something that could be initiated for public events, and the business school expert on our panel probably has some thoughts about how they might be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. Just to the overall idea of who should own the events, I think they should be campus specific. So each campus owns their events, and their students at those campuses can interact with the speakers. So especially when we start having speakers come back to campus. For example, the Program for Public Discourse runs not only a main event with the speakers, but also has spin-off events for students to interact with the individual speakers. So there's the main event, but then afterwards there's, if there's say 3 panelists on a panel, there might be 3 individual events for students who want to listen to that speaker, have a chance to interact with them. As far as how much funding it takes, I mean, there is already a model that we have at UNC with again, the Program for Public Discourse that, could be followed. It doesn't have to be the exact model that's being used there, but, the expertise exists within the system. So it's not like every university would have to come up, to design theirs from scratch. They could look at what's been done at UNC and decide, hey, we want to have it a little bit different, or we want to follow that model, but tweak it a little bit that way. But there is a model, so there's not it's not something that would have to be created from scratch by each university.
Beyond the process, the infrastructure, the money, et cetera, what about the political climate? Are we in a time where we could actually have a robust debate without having one debater or the other referred to as engaging in hate speech? Professor Noue mentioned this when he was talking about his findings, because some of the most fascinating issues of our time are inherently controversial, whether it's women's sports and the issue of transgender athletes, which is becoming something that many states are now having to deal with, or whether it is the role of the United States in world affairs, the Iran nuclear deal, et cetera. Are we able to actually engage today without saying, well, we're going to protest this because that person's view is inherently racist, homophobic, hate speech of one kind or another?
Well, I think it depends on the topics you choose, and I think universities should be careful to have a balance of topics. But I also think if they pick the right participants, people who actually have a knowledge base, people who respect the other position, that makes a huge difference and displays for students something very important for them to see. I was invited to debate at the University of Baltimore Law School. The debate was called New Frontiers in Religious Liberty, and we were debating when religious liberty should create an exemption to otherwise valid civil rights laws. And the person I debated, a professor at the law school, and I agreed at the beginning of the debate we would state in common what we agreed on. We both were very protective of religious liberty, though we thought it applied in different ways. I think that's a good model. The debaters, people on a forum, should state what they agree on as well as what they disagree about. Students need to hear that.
Interesting. We've got, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, Jenna, I thought you were trying to get in there. Let me give you a couple of comments, questions that we've gotten on Facebook. I think they're rather interesting. Joey writes, the problem is not so much discrimination or diversity. The issue is that conservatives don't exercise their rights and force the issue. Scott writes, really very simply, ask every college how many conservatives have tenure, how many conservatives teach at your college. Clearly, these two folks believe that what is missing is the conservative voice. Anyone?
This is Mark. There was an interesting study that just came out, and I'm trying to think of where I learned about it, but it's from an organization, CSPI, and I'm trying to find the data on it. But it was basically an organization that the study was done by a professor at Oxford who, in the UK, and it was done of faculty in the US, UK, and Canada. And some of the findings they had was in the social sciences and humanities, over 9 and 10 Trump supporting academics and 8 and 10 Brexit supporting academics said they wouldn't feel comfortable expressing their views to a colleague. And then more than half of the North American and British conservative academics admitted to self-censoring. Another one was that in the US, over a third of academics and PhD students had been threatened with disciplinary action for their views, while 70% of conservative academics reported a hostile departmental climate. And so this I just saw this. I haven't dived into the study, but it was one of the first ones I think that was done of faculty that looks at some of the challenges that faculty face. And it gets into as well, I believe, the hiring of faculty, are they, how some of the challenges they face getting into institutions as well.
Yeah, we constantly hear that from folks about the issue of conservative students feeling, at least in some cases, that they can't, in a classroom, for example, express what they think. And I know, Mark, your report was taking a look at that, at the environment at Chapel Hill. I hope, by the way, that you're able to somehow get word, I guess, this week that your study would be modeled for other campuses. That would be really nice to see. What about the role of anxiety, whether it's students or faculty or the administrators who fear there's going to be a protest, or they don't want any more controversy, as Professor Noue referred to it, kind of the branding issue, not wanting to be seen perhaps as having some sort of unrest on your campus. What role does that play in all this?
Well, I think for a university to say, we can't stage a public policy event because it might be controversial, or because some members of our student body or some alums or some legislators might object, is to give up on the mission of higher education. Yes, there will be some painful steps along the way. Yes, there may be some protests. But if you choose your subjects carefully and you choose the participants carefully and you have clear rules about what can be disrupted and what you can't disrupt, then this is something that needs to be done. There are some risks in lots of things that higher education does. And its civic mission seems to me to have the priority that administrators should say, we have to do this, and we have to do it well. And if there are some bumps, then we have to learn from those bumps, and next year we'll do it better.
I remember when in college, one of the classes that I had to take, and I don't even remember exactly what the class was, but I had to express my view on an issue. And then, unbeknownst to me, what the professor then did was assign me to write a paper based on supporting the opposite view. And it was essentially learning to defend and investigate and learn more about the other point of view. Do we have enough of that? Is that maybe the source of our problem with people's inability to accept that others may have a different point of view, to accept it without getting mean about it? Is that we've never actually had to look into the other point of view and argue it?
Donna, I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the issue. I think we also have to remember that the professor is exactly right, that this is the type of thing universities should be doing. But in terms of student demand, my guess is this is much lower on the priority list. I mean, we all know students who go in there who really want to learn about topics and engage with people of all viewpoints. But a lot of students are just there because mom and dad told them they had to go because that's the way they're going to get a job. So they want to go to the class, do as little work as possible, make as few waves as possible, get the grades you need to get the degree, and then get out of there and enjoy other things along the way, like the sports we've been talking about. So this is the type of thing that while a university needs to be involved in these types of events, you're also having to fight against the large number of people on the campus who would really rather just kind of go through the motions, get the piece of paper, and leave.
You know, our history here in North Carolina is rather unique as well. Jen, I know that you're very well versed in the fact that back in the 1960s, we had the Act to Regulate Visiting Speakers. It was commonly known as the Speakers Ban, and specifying that people who were known members of the Communist Party or who had pled the Fifth when they were accused of that would not be permitted to speak on any state-sponsored campus. And I believe it was the late Bill Friday who was very much, you know, a defender of free speech, et cetera. So we've kind of gone from that history in the 60s, and then our general understanding of the university campus as the marketplace of ideas to a cancel culture. And really from the 1960s to now, that's a few decades, but not that long in terms of history itself. And it just seems, you know, ironic to me from the speaker's ban to here.
Yeah, it is remarkable how much things have changed. And I know that UNC Chapel Hill in particular is proud of its resistance to the speaker ban. If you talk to people, say in the School of Journalism, they're very proud that they were the ones who said, you know, this isn't okay, we're going to host these speakers anyway. And I will defend the system a little bit in that most of our schools are very open to speakers. Speakers, you know, the schools would do nothing to prevent speakers who were invited to campus from coming and giving their talk. The rules on the books are actually supportive of people coming and talking about, you know, whatever topic that they want to. I think that, you know, what George is pointing out is being allowed to come to campus and being invited to campus are two different things. And so the problem we're having is that speakers aren't being invited. You know, it's nobody's job. There's no budget. And, you know, maybe there's no appetite, at least from the point of view of the administrators who are afraid of, you know, students heckling, using the heckler's veto to shout it down. But I think what we have to remember, and Mark has the data on this, is that the students who are willing to shut down a viewpoint with which they disagree are a minority on campus. And I think, Mark, it was less than 20%. Is that, you can correct me. But the vast
20%.
majority, I'm sorry, what was it?
Yeah, it was 19%, yeah.
19%. And so most students would listen or at least ignore a speaker with whom they disagree. You know, they wouldn't come out and heckle. And so I think that we have to remember that this small minority should not determine policy at our campuses. The campuses have a duty to set a better standard than that.
Yeah, and I would add just on what Jenna was saying, that our research found that students across the political spectrum did want more opportunities to engage with people that thought differently than them. Unsurprisingly, about 92% of respondents who were identified as conservative thought UNC invited too few conservative speakers, but more respondents who identified as liberal, about 37%, said that there were too few conservative speakers than said there were too many, which was around 15%. And about 58% of students who identified as liberal, 62% who were moderate, and 76% who were conservative felt the need for more constructive disagreement across the political spectrum. So there is an appetite out there among the students for more constructive dialogue and for hearing different views.
Professor Noue, as we wind down here for today's forum, do you think it's just an issue of perhaps that university administrators didn't realize, it just never dawned on them that, hey, there's this dearth of kind of a formula for doing this, or the infrastructure for doing it, or the budget for doing it, that it's just kind of not been on the radar, and that perhaps your report is what's going to put this on the radar?
I think that's certainly a part of it. Administrator comes in and there's a structure, knows that there's a theater department, knows there's a music department, knows there's an athletic department, knows there's a campus newspaper, there's a curriculum in place, and there's a structure that is familiar to almost anybody who takes a top administrative position. And the fact that there is no systematic presentation of alternative public policy points of view is not going to be there. It's not risen to the top of considerations. That's why I think that legislators and boards are going to have to ask for more information about this. If they do, the president's not going to want to come back to the board or a legislative committee and say, I don't have the slightest idea what goes on in terms of public policy events on my campus. That won't happen. So if we can get this engine started, and I hope the media will play some role in this too, because I think the media has a stake in having a more rational, civil, well-informed public policy discussions. It's something they ought to cover. It's something they ought to encourage. But basically, unless boards and legislative committees say, we want reports about this, I don't think much is likely to change. As I began, higher education is in a pretty traumatic situation right now in many places, not everywhere. And there's a lot on the agenda. So if we don't get this on the agenda, it won't change.
Well, this report hopefully will bring some change to what we have seen here. And again, this is the cover. It's called Political Reality on North Carolina Campuses, Examining Policy Debates and Forums with Diverse Viewpoints. It has been authored by one of our guests here today, Professor George Noue. The link to this report is in the comments section of the John Locke Foundation Facebook page, as is the link to the report from about this time in 2020, which was co-authored by one of our panelists, Mark McNeely, Free Expression and Constructive Dialogue at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Fascinating results in here as well. Both of those available in the comments section. Well, folks, I really appreciate you joining us today for this. Mitch Kokai, Jenna Robinson, George Noue, and Mark McNeely, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your perspective on all of this. And we appreciate you, as we do every Monday. We so much appreciate that you are engaged, you're curious, you are interested in the topics that we're bringing to you. Of course, what we do here at the John Locke Foundation is all about defending and advancing freedom, free thought, free ideas, free expression. We're so glad you were along for this one. I would ask you to make one consideration today as we leave you, and that is, we are a nonprofit organization. If you like what we're doing and you want to support forums like this, we would greatly appreciate you considering a tax-deductible donation to the John Locke Foundation. It's very simple and quick to do. Just go to johnlocke.org, and in the upper right-hand corner is the Donate tab. Hit that. It's secure, it's fast, it's easy, less than 2 minutes, and you can make your donation to help us defend and support freedom. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a great week. Be back here right in the same space on Monday at noon next week for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal team, I'm Donna Martinez. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.